Well, good morning again. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come back and present part two of Vermont Visionaries, which is more stories from the Smith family of St. Albans, based on the amount of items I wasn't able to include in today's talk. Hopefully there'll be a part three, because it can go on. But I did want to make sure to give a recap for those of you who weren't with us in November of who exactly the Smith family was, and I'll just spend a couple minutes doing this. Over multiple generations, the Smith family of St. Albans crafted an impressive legacy which impacted all aspects of our community life. As I shared with you before, they were politicians, they were entrepreneurs, they were farmers, philosophers, philanthropists, writers who contributed to our economic, political, and social development here in northwestern Vermont. And their legacy really parallels some of the most important events of the history of the Green Mountain State. And again, I'm glad to be able to come back with you and share some more details on this family today, focusing a little bit more on their contributions specifically to the library, the railroad, and to local architectural gems. I'm not a railroad historian, I'm not an architectural historian, but I have some great support from some. I should also forewarn you, for one of my senior history seminars in college, John forgot to mention I had BA from the University of Maine, which I only bring up because today is Maine Day, so go on campus. One of my professors wrote on one of my exams that I gave new meaning to the term the lost generation. So I'm not always great with maps and directions, so I had some fun trying to reposition myself with some of the architectural history. But just to, again, emphasize, they weren't the only ones who contributed to the story of the St. Albans, but certainly the Smiths really kind of tell the tale about who we are as a community. And to recap for you, the family sort of began its story here in St. Albans with John Smith, who moved here in 1800, studied law, and was admitted to the bar in 1810. He opened a private practice, married Maria Curtis, served as Franklin County State's Attorney for Vermont in the State House as a Vermont legislator, and was also Vermont's congressional representative. He was a member of the founding board of directors for the Vermont Central Railroad in 1843, and was the first president of the Vermont and Canada Railroad, which was 1845. So of course you can see railroading begins with the family. John Gregory Smith, who I talked about last time, just to recap, a graduate of the Franklin County Grammar School, located on this property, UVM and Yale Law, married Anna Eliza Brainerd in 1843. Was the president of the Vermont Central Railroad, which established its headquarters in the early 1860s. Was the founder of what we know as the CVR, the Central Vermont Railroad, in 1873. Again, serving in the House and Vermont Senate, and of course governor during the Civil War. Brother, Worthing Curtis Smith, who was also a graduate of UVM, married Catherine Walworth in 1850. If you see a trend, you're not the only one serving in the Vermont House and Senate, but then going on to serve 3 terms in Congress. He was president of the St. Albans Foundry Company and the National Bank, served as vice president to the CBR. Of course, we talked last time about Anna Eliza, who was an author, poet, and involved in the Vermont Women's Exposition in 1876. Edward Curtis Smith, as you guessed, started out with the study of law, as was usual in his family, and embarked on a 55-year career with the railroad, operating as a director, legal counsel, general manager, and eventually vice president. Railroading continued on in the family. This is Frank Walworth Smith, another son, who actually served in the Colorado State Senate and was involved in the railroad out in the 1890s. So if you weren't at the lecture last fall, that gives you kind of a brief update on who the major players were in the Smith family that we looked at and their involvement in our local civic life, our local community life, and especially our local economic life. St. Albans is the rail city, and in fact the museum is embarking on a new project that's going to be announced within the next month called the Rail City History Project. And this is an effort designed to bring in those who have family connections to the CVR or who were veterans of the railroad, associated businesses, agriculture, and other industries in town, passenger transport, and those sorts of things. And the idea is to sort of capture those stories, because we're really approaching the last generations who have direct connection to this story. And as you know now, you'll see pictures in a bit of the railroad building. There's not much left. There's been talk about whether it's going to continue to operate as a dispatching center or whether that operation is going to move to Colchester. So for an industry that's been vital to our area since the 1840s, we're really starting to see a new chapter. And rail's not going away, right? We're having conversations about passenger service to Montreal and things like that. But sort of the CVR as we knew it historically and in our family stories is really starting to move more and more behind us. So we're really going to be encouraging people to come forward to share artifacts, to share memories, to share stories, and to help kind of give it that personal touch. Because we certainly know it was the largest employer here in town for generations, and there's a lot of history there that still needs to be told. So certainly keep your eye on that. But I want to shift for a minute to the St. Albans Free Library, which the Smiths played an important part in. And it does not begin with the building on Maiden Lane, although that's the Smith contribution. Originally, the first library, in quotes, here in St. Albans was in the 1850s, 1855, and was actually part of the Vermont Central Railroad Library Association. So $1,000 railroad bond, sale of stock from members who may not have been railroad employees funded it. And it featured 2,600 volumes, which were available and could be distributed, by the railroad for local use. So that was sort of the beginning part of how the library came to St. Albans. In 1861, there was a citizen named Henry Hunt who had passed away and had left a small amount to the village to establish a public library. Trustees were immediately appointed. The names you'll recognize: Hort, Houghton, Farrar, who were originally part of establishing it. And the initial collection, which had mostly an emphasis on agriculture, also had some books at the town clerk's office. By the 1870s, the Brainerd family is running a book business, and you see the formation of a Franklin County Literary Club, which subscribed to magazines and newspapers, and you can sort of imagine in European salon style, they would meet to have conversation and discussion about the issues of the day, about the things they were reading. That eventually ended up on Kingman Street. Again, you see local names like Seymour and others. And the community starts bringing together reference books, charts, maps, reading material. The collection grows to 3,000 volumes. Unfortunately, the Great Fire of 1895, which you may have heard about in other OLLI talks here or during your tour in the museum, destroyed a large portion of that collection, except things that were out in circulation or in storage. There was a temporary solution for the library until the current construction began in 1902. So you can see here, these are advertisements from the St. Albans Messenger, noting that because of a contribution of J. Gregory Smith, that a new library was to be constructed. It was to contain a memorial hall recognizing the Grand Army of the Republic, and was really described in documents, letters, and newspaper articles of the day as a gift to the people of St. Albans from the Smith family. Again, part of his legacy of giving back to the community and promoting education. The new building on Maiden Lane, which you're all familiar with, was finished in 1902 by the W.B. Fonda Company, again, another local connection. Governor Smith had provided in his will a sum for the library building, as well as a soldier's monument. The family, who were the executors of the will, recognized that this would be a building that would contribute to public life, not only as a library and a place for ideas and inspiration and sharing books, but as a place to recognize the contribution of veterans. John Gregory was known as one of the most active governors, as I talked with you about last time, during the Civil War, for his support of getting medical aid to troops and making sure that Vermont soldiers were taken care of in POW camps. So again, this is sort of just a continuation of that legacy in a new form. They provided the plaque that sits in the entrance to the library. And again, because most of the collection had been destroyed in the Great Fire of 1895, there was a real effort to rebuild that. And the capacity envisioned with the original library building was 16,000 volumes. So you can see, for a community that was growing, was becoming a central railroad hub that had thousands of workers employed by the railroad, this was a tremendous gift, from a collection of about 2,500 to 3,000 works that had mostly been lost to creating space for 16,000 volumes, was really contributing to the civic life and the education of the community. There's some great architectural details, including, and unfortunately my picture of it didn't come out, but including the stained glass window on the stair and other things, and of course the library is supported today on an ongoing basis through contributions from the city and the town, through our taxes. So certainly, in thinking about the legacy of Governor Smith, about his care for soldiers, about his care for community, about his belief in the importance of education, dialogue, and debate, it absolutely makes sense that upon his passing, he saw that St. Albans would have one of the finest libraries in the state of Vermont, constructed and utilized for local purposes with an emphasis on St. Albans. The next piece I want to share with you is, and that information comes from our archives here. I wanted to share a little bit more of a unique perspective on the CVR headquarters, the train shed, and these talking points come from an article in Trains Magazine in 1958, where the author Jim Shaughnessy is really kind of calling out that maybe the grand age of rail was starting to shift, and that St. Albans wasn't as busy a hub as it used to be, but he was asking visitors to sort of harken back to the past and put yourself in that Victorian mindset, and what must this place have been like. And he was writing that in 1958, and to me it's just kind of interesting that here we are in 2019 and we're sort of having a parallel conversation about what's going to happen to the train shed. And so he sort of describes it as this ghost from the past. He calls it, and I'm quoting, a specimen and a handsome one of Victorian railroad architecture. And so he sort of walks through and he says, imagine yourself that you're a traveler coming from Boston on the evening train at the Montreal, and the first thing you'll notice as you pass through is the old-style signal system. On the way in the train shed, trains pass two ball-type signals still in use. By day, several red-painted cans suspended from a chain pass the signal to the engine man. By night, oil lamps suspended in the same way burn in the same positions. Partway down the pole, there is a round shield in which one or two balls can be lowered by hand, depending on the indication given. Two other signals are located at the north station, making for four in the area. So again, what he's really getting at is that this was an operation that was driven by people. So for all we talk about the age of the iron horse, right, and the advances in rail technology and steam technology eventually, and how trains were sort of these marvels of technological wonder, there's an immense amount of muscle, of people power, of physical labor in running the trains and making sure the tracks are working and taking care of repairs and in operating the system itself in a way that is just sort of lost. If you've traveled by rail in the last 5, 10, 15, 20 years, Amtrak or something like that, of course everything is automated and run by computers, much like air travel. So this really does sort of harken back to a different time. And here you can see just a larger view of the headquarters building itself on the corner of what's now Federal and Lake. So when he talks about a train coming in to Lake Street, it enters this great barn-like structure with huge brick arch portals, which I'll show you in a few minutes. This really just conveys the enormity. Of course, now if you drive down Lake Street, you may be inconvenienced from time to time by one railroad track. Imagine when there were 23 across Lake Street. So certainly that gives you a sense of the scale and the size of how busy this was as a railroad hub. We sort of think of the term, above or below the tracks as a bit outdated, but for a time that meant something, whether it was sort of inter-community strife. For those of you who remember the term blockers and those sorts of things, there was a socioeconomic connotation around whether you could afford to live literally above or below, but also think about trying to manage moving people, horses and goods around 23 tracks that are operating most of the day and into the night. Right? It would be a logistical nightmare for sure. The train shed itself was 351 feet long, 88 feet wide, and covered 4 tracks. Built in 1866-67, it's 4 stories high. At the north end, there's the office building that you can see in the previous picture in this one. And so that contained a waiting room, or excuse me, near the office building, you had the waiting room, the ticket office, the lunchroom, the baggage and express handling facilities. To the left of the station, again, which I'll show you pictures of in a few moments, are the shop buildings of the original railway. So what was unique about the Central Vermont Railway is that it was sort of a self-contained business. So the engines obviously would pass through here, they would pick up cargo here, they would pick up passengers here. We talked about last time how the railroad at one point stretched from a CBR-owned pier in New York City all the way to the Great Lakes. It was the 7th largest railroad in St. Albans. So you can imagine the type of volume. It's connecting New England to Canada, it's connecting Vermont to Boston, down to New York, to the Midwest. So certainly, you know, a place that would see a lot of activity and a lot of different types of business. So it wasn't just that it was a transportation hub. They had to have the facilities on site to be able to make repairs, to build parts and other things so that they could service the track themselves and that they could provide the necessary tools and other equipment to keep the trains running and to keep things moving smoothly and on schedule. One thing that was especially noteworthy about the train shed is the 88-foot width. The interior spanned by wooden trusses built by William Howe. So these Howe trusses were considered unusual in design in that they have curved upper and lower chords. Again, I'm not an architectural historian, but just noting that they had unique features and details, different than what you might see on a covered bridge, for example. They follow the curve and the bracing design of the arch. The timbers are wood, and the upright members are iron rods. So again, these were sort of known as Howe trusses. Were invented in 1840 by a mechanic carpenter who lived in Massachusetts, who was connected to the Western Railroad and a railroad family. In 1842, he was designing a new roof for the Boston and Worcester Depot, and then brought that design with him to St. Albans for that part of the construction. That was a design that you could see in later years in Buffalo, Rochester, Troy, Springfield, Reading, and Chicago. So we have a very sort of unique building here. Harris and Hawkins was the architectural firm that constructed the train shed. Daniel Harris from Massachusetts, which is a bridge builder, contractor, engineer, and himself had been the one-time president of the Connecticut River Railroad. Hawkins, his partner, started out as an office boy, working his way up to partner and later owned his own ironworks company. So again, when the CVR decided to establish their headquarters here, you know, they brought in a firm that was well known, well respected from Massachusetts, and that for at least part of the construction would use elements that would go on to become sort of iconic in later building. And again, to give you the size of the scope, here's an aerial view of including the grain elevator looking north. So I mentioned before the railroad was impactful in terms of local industry, particularly dairy and grain and other elements of agriculture. New England has been St. Albans has been the butter capital, the dairy capital, of course we're the maple syrup capital, in addition to being the rail city, and the fact that we were able to move such large volumes of agricultural product from here to other parts of New England meant that we played a really pivotal role in feeding and taking care of generations of Americans, and it was through this compound that stretched throughout St. Albans, and I can see on my next slide that unfortunately I missed including the map of the grounds. I'll be sure to share that with you next time, but again, just giving you a look at the yard and the sense of what a logistically complex operation this was. How many trains were moving, where they were going, switching tracks, changing cargo, and those sorts of things. You know, imagine the level of sophistication and planning and daily work that it took to make this operate. Thinking about the office building itself, I'll just go back for a moment. That part is 120 feet by 70 feet with a mansard-style roof. Originally, the building was heated by fireplaces, which you can imagine went out of fashion well, later on. When they installed central heating, some of those chimneys were actually removed. But sort of imagine yourself walking through the doors. You'd see the sign that said General Offices, along with the maple leaf crest, in a hallway filled with gleaming woodwork. Each side of the hall lined with offices for dispatchers and other railroad employees. On the left, in the middle, a gigantic maple staircase, scenes presented, representing the railroad and the places that it travels. Green carpeting, mahogany furniture, some sort of the finest vintages of architecture and decoration, really representing the amount of capital and wealth and ingenuity that went into building this company and making it so successful. Imagine yourself in a waiting room and ticket office that's about 260 by 27 feet. The entire structure occupying 46,000 square feet, or just over an acre. And in fact, it's important to keep in mind that this was the second depot in St. Albans. I'll show you the original one later on. But this came about because of the Smith family, because of J. Gregory Smith, because of the family involvement in the railroad, because of their fortune, their fame, their influence, their political capital, and their willingness to make this successful. They were able to capitalize on the natural advantages of our geographic location and to move the railroad forward. Gregory Smith, J. Gregory Smith certainly envisioned this as the best depot on the entire line that would serve as their headquarters building. He insisted on the best materials, the finest furnishings, making sure that the property was well cared for and maintained. And again, recognizing that this was really the heartbeat of the CVR, whether through the operations of the railroad itself. Here you can see the 600 engine. Just imagine the size and scope and the scale of how big these actually were. Here's another view of the 215. You can see the worker on the front. So again, just imagine if there were one or two people standing on top of me, then you're getting a sense of how big these engines were. Here you can see Governor Smith had his own personal train that he was entitled to through the virtues of his office. Again, coming out here, and of course, outfitted and decorated in a manner that was accustomed to his position. I mentioned that it was important to be self-sufficient, so here you can see a great shot inside one of the work areas. Again, they had to be responsible for creating parts and pieces and being able to perform repairs and take care of things themselves. So it really was an all-encompassing, comprehensive operation. Here's a great interior shot, again, giving you the sense of the size and scope. And I mentioned that there were many who saw the development of this architectural wonder, as unique, as groundbreaking, as something to be envied here in New England. And in fact, some of the elements were used in advertising for later products. I mentioned that it replaced the original depot, so take a look at what you see here and then imagine what comes next. Here's the advertisement I mentioned. So there was an article that was written up in a consumer publication where they were admiring the roof and those trusses, those howe trusses that I mentioned before, and how well preserved they were. And they talk about how, a simple, basic coat of whitewash and general care helped it stand the test of time. And this occurred in 1920, so you can see we're talking about roughly 60 years after the original construction. There were people still marveling at the size and scope and the architectural detail. And of course, for those of you that are residents, will know that in the mid-1863, you start to see initial conversations around the destruction of the CVR. And so there was an announcement in the newspaper, and you can sort of see they were a bit caught off guard. The railroad authorities argued that it was cheaper to demolish the building than to allow it to be maintained at current levels. And you can see on the lower part that they put out for bids for a firm to come in and manage that. And I imagine some people here remember that, as an event when it went down. I had a few board members that told the story about how they stood outside and watched it happen. Of course, the headquarters building is still there, and some other remnants that have become some of the Lake Street businesses. But if you think back to what this was, certainly it is a ghost of its former self. And just to give you a sense of how the railroad operated, in 1868, as it was starting to enter peak production, 2,606,880 pounds of butter, 276,000 pounds of cheese, and 14,102 cases of mineral water made their way through St. Albans. In addition to mail, people as passengers and other gear. So again, it really demonstrates to you that the legacy of the Smith family and the Central Vermont Railroad is not just the line itself. It's the people who were given jobs in St. Albans, who made their livelihoods from the railroad, and who were able to look at this grand building on Lake and Federal Streets for generation after generation and recognize that this is a piece of what defined us as the rail city. So I'd like to move on to personal architecture, if you will, and to share some images of two homes, the first being what was known as the Towers. This, again, was the home of Governor John Gregory Smith and his wife, Anne Eliza Brainerd Smith. The photos I'm going to show you now come from the collections here at the museum. The Towers was a 46-room, that's 46 separate rooms, house, built in 1852 in what was known as the French Second Empire style, to give you a sense of the architecture, and you're certainly going to see as we walk through this the European influences. The house stood at the southeast corner of Smith and Congress Streets and would serve as their home throughout their lives. If you're familiar with the story of the St. Albans Raid, there's the mention that Anne, her husband was out of town, stood on the steps of the porch with an unloaded pistol, daring any of the Confederate raiders to confront the governor's mansion. And it's one of the neat side stories of the raid. And unfortunately, in 1937, the home was torn down, sort of having outlived its utility, and perhaps just dwarfed by the cost of maintenance because of its sheer size. But it was the working home, the working office of the governor, as well as their personal home. So just some great outdoor views, stereo vision views. So again, it was something that was documented. Some of these photos come from our collection, others come from Massachusetts Digital Commons. And so this was architecture that was certainly known to people who were interested in these things at the time, outside of our community. And of course, a great view. You can see Lake Champlain in the distance, looking out into St. Albans, about as grand as they come. Here you have what was known as the back library, in case one library wasn't enough, and your house had to have two of them. Again, I mentioned the family's kind of commitment to education and literacy, and they had their own extensive private collection of volumes as well. Here you can see a small part of a formal dining room, the clock and the china cabinet in the back. Here's the governor and Mrs. Smith by the fountain that graced the entrance to their home. Again, another family photo of a very busy front lawn of course with the fountain and some other great architecture, swans, because of course every governor's home has to have swans in front of it. But again, you can just see the level of detail, and again the scale. Looking at some of the folks standing in the back, this is what you would see on the approach to the home. Stepping from the grand lawn into what was known as the entrance hall, again you can see the statuary and the other details that really speak to that European aesthetic, design, style, and I'll show you a few pieces later. They would go on to acquire, through their many grand tours of Europe, different pieces of furniture and ephemera that they would have shipped back to decorate their home. This is another library view. The upper hall at the top of the staircase that you saw a couple slides ago. And again, just noting ornate draperies, portraits on the wall, level of decoration, furniture, every piece with a purpose and a story. And there's another view of them outside with the family pet and their son George, who was too busy to look at the camera. Sounds familiar. The drawing room, again, sort of a formal space with the fireplace, statuary, and those sorts of things. The veranda, some gorgeous outdoor seating with a wonderful view. You can see the trees in the background, open-sided to enjoy those Vermont days that are nicer than today, or the one in February where we missed this talk originally. I mentioned it was a working office as well as a home. So Governor Smith had his own office there. So you can see a great picture here. I'll show you in a minute the State Seal of Vermont that he had commissioned to hang in his office, which is now a part of the museum collections you can see downstairs. But he was able to often conduct his business here at home rather than having to travel to Burlington or Montpelier. I apologize, the lighting wasn't fantastic. This was the best I could do. But here you can see the State Seal that he had commissioned, placed in his office, and now is part of not State Seal, excuse me, Vermont Coat of Arms, which is now part of our collections. So again, from our knowledge of this artifact is that it was commissioned during the Civil War. The artist's last name was Fisk, but we don't know much detail beyond that. Some of the pieces that were in the towers before it was demolished went to other Smith homes for other family members, which is why they were able to survive and be part of our collections today. I mentioned that the Smith family often traveled. So actually one of the oldest pieces in our collection here at SAM is this Venetian decorative urn from Italy that you can see on the left-hand side. On the right is an ornate tea set that was a gift. And again, another beautiful piece of furniture here. Just note the ornate detail in the piece. Again, for as much ostentation, wealth, status that they were able to display through their own work here in their home in Vermont, they often spent months at a time, abroad, collecting artwork, collecting furniture, collecting decorative pieces that would form the basis of what you see in some of these interior photographs. I won't talk about them too much today, but I mentioned that the Smith family was involved in agriculture and farming, so you can see here a shot of the hill farm, and they also had a farm at Hathaway Point, which I hope to talk with you about at a future time. The other residence to mention is what's known as 7 Acres, which burned in 1924. We were fortunate that an album of photographs was given to the museum so that we can give you some interior views. Here again is the family in front of the home in their carriage. I can tell you it was considered a great loss when the home burned in 1924. It was November 4th in the morning. The Smith family had contacted local contractors to discuss, next steps, but also, as you can imagine, with any house fire, to deal with the insurance company and the adjustment around the contents of the home, which at the time were valued between the home and the items inside it at $119,648.58. And again, this is in 1924 dollars. And there were some items saved. They managed to save 24 large silver forks, 12 pearl handle knives. I think this list is really interesting. I'm going to share some of it with you. 12 oyster forks, 12 spoons made by Reed and Barton, which were used to eat oranges, 6 ivory handle knives, 12 tortoiseshell fruit knives, an asparagus set. I'm not sure what an asparagus set is. Candelabra, meat knives, and a tea bell, and a silver cup. So obviously they were able to grab some things from the dining or kitchen area and save them. But just walking through that list, a family that has separate silverware for different types of produce and fruit gives you a sense of the style to which they were accustomed. Unfortunately, some of the things that were lost, 3,400 pounds of coffee valued at $1,500, 16 tons of coal in the cellar from the part of the pantry that they were not able to save, a dinner set featuring 36 dinner plates, but only 24 breakfast plates, 36 butter plates, 24 cups and saucers, plus butler's aprons, the afternoon tea set, which was entirely separate, and a collection of antique china. The chairs from the dining area, which were made with imported silk and velvet for cushioning, 4 Chinese lamps, antique mahogany chairs, sadly a wedding dress of white satin trimmed with rose point lace, 2 brass beds, a mahogany chest of drawers, 12 volumes of the poet Kipling, stationery from Tiffany and Company, a Dutch chest that dated to the 1790s, a carved bookcase, an evening dress with rhinestone trimming, a white satin wedding dress, 5 dozen French embroidered handkerchiefs, aprons, dresses, collars, cuffs, and caps that belonged to the maids and serving staff, kimonos, 1 pink and heavily embroidered, 1 gray, pictures from Spain, a William and Mary armchair brought back from Europe, another bedspread, 1 antique from the 1830s, another from their travels in Spain, a gold Egyptian scarf that was purchased to be made into an evening dress but had not yet been constructed, a library of 250 books from one of the butlers, 4 suits of clothes, 5 pairs of shoes, 2 silver mugs, 2 razor sops, and so on and so on. A Tiffany lamp, inlaid black mahogany beds. From Mr. Smith's personal closet, he had several. This was only the 3rd floor closet. Sorry, I just lost it. 25 suits, 20 overcoats, 4 silk hats, 65 silk vests, 24 white dress shirts, 36 silk shirts, 50 silk ties, 48 collars, 18 pairs of gloves. So again, just recognizing the wealth, the influence, the status, the lifestyle, what it must have been like when the museum published photographs of this residence as their weekly feature, I think in the 1980s and again in the 90s. They referenced this Grand Victorian style, and when we ran it again a few years ago, there was reference to this kind of Downton Abbey lifestyle. So you can really kind of put yourself in the mindset of what this family's life was like. And you can see here some of the results of the house being burned in 1924. But thanks to this photo album that we have in the museum collection, you are able to see some interior shots. They're unlabeled, but here you can see, again, a library. Either a library or sitting room with a formal fireplace. Dining area. what may be a bedroom or another sitting area. You can see the family portrait on the wall. Again, the fireplace. Another view. Of course, an outside veranda, of which all the furniture was lost in the fire. And then just to give you a sense of the beautiful grounds and gardens and what it looked like. So again, when the newspaper described, the messenger described this, it was considered to be a lost landmark. But again, I hope it sort of gives you a bit of an illustration of what the Smith family meant. When we talk about the railroad, we literally mean they built up the Central Vermont Railroad, not just the line, but the headquarters building that was the economic center of St. Albans for generations. Some of the finest homes, examples of European architectural and style, of some of the grand elements of what we would think of as Victorian era living, all right here in St. Albans as part of the Smith family. And certainly they will go down in history as among the most influential and the most wealthy of families in St. Albans. But what I appreciate about their legacy is that they balanced it with their incredible philanthropy and sense of community, and the fact that they were willing to make so many gifts to the people of St. Albans and for the future generations of St. Albans, I think speaks volumes to their character and their impact and influence on our story. And I hope to be able to come back to you again and share there are other Smith homes in town, and then the next generation of the Smith properties, the carriage house, the Governor Smith Inn, and those sorts of things as well. There are certainly more stories to be told, but I am glad to have spent this time with you. Thank you.
Questions for Alex? Could you go back before Jackson, so the picture this is downstairs? The portrait? That one, no. That one. That's downstairs.
Was the income from the railroad derived mostly from transportation of people or transportation of freight?
So I'll open it up to my fellow railroad experts. My guess would be freight. Is that true? Yes. More for goods than people. It's a good question.
I was about 20 years old when they tore down that train shed. And I remember being very, very upset about it. But I didn't know what to do. If it hadn't been another 20 years later, I would have had a lot of skills. And they called me militant Miller back then. But I wasn't there yet. And I felt very badly. I look back on that and think, why weren't there more people involved in saving that? And I know they said it was needed to be torn down, but as I remember, they had a terrible time getting that building down. And so anyway, I just wanted to say that I think of that, and I lived down on the west side, so all the time I would go up to school past the building, and I always loved it. I always loved it for whatever reason. It was just beautiful. So I just needed to say that.
Yeah, no, it's, I think the historic preservation movement, as we understand it today, is certainly a bit of a modern phenomenon. There are so many, think of the towers and other places where there was just not always a concept of what would the legacy or the value of this be for future generations. It was, it was about utility. This is a building, it no longer serves the purpose we need. There wasn't a conversation about what it might mean for the history. So I think that consciousness is starting to change, but you're right in that it sort of reflects a time when we didn't always have that awareness or ability to do something to make a difference.
Well, I just wondered when it was right at its peak of prosperity and everything, how many people would it employ the railroad?
The number I recall is a couple thousand, right? 3,000, 4,000? Glad Liza's here, not backing up. Yeah, so that was one of the considerations, in fact, for the St. Albans Raid, when they were kind of the bank robbery on Main Street, they targeted it so that it wasn't market day. The legislature was in session. There was a Supreme Court session in Burlington, so maybe most of the Main Street would be empty. But the primary concern for Lieutenant Ben Young and the other raiders was that they were, 100 yards away from the railroad station, and if they were in any way alerted, had set off an alarm, that it would foil their plans. So certainly you can imagine the impact of that many workers on that much space, what it must have been like to work there.
The population of St. Albans, has it increased or decreased as a result of the loss of the large employment of the railroad?
My understanding is greater St. Albans today is 12,000, 13,000, is that right? 14? I guess I'm not sure. I'll have to get back to it. I don't know if that represents it. Certainly, I think with the modern industrial park, there's going to be a replacement of some of that. But I can imagine maybe if you went and looked back at the census records, you would see some ebbs and flows that tied into how busy the railroad train yard was, for sure. That's a great question.
Alex, do you happen to know the history of the stained glass that's in the library?
I don't. I had a little bit on it. I will definitely bring that to part 3. If you get a chance to go up there, I think there's a little plaque next to it. It's gorgeous.
You may have said this in part 1, but I think we're blessed that we, the museum, are still in contact with the descendants of the Smith family and their supporters, and very appreciative of what we've done at the Smith Room downstairs.
You could do a whole talk on the Smith family that was never part of St. Albans. The later descendants who moved out west, who were heavily involved in countless other railroads, businesses, industries. Charlotte mentioned certainly today there's still family connections to this community, and it is one of our active exhibits. So if you weren't here for the Maple Festival, a classic spring Vermont weekend, down the rain. Come back this summer, come see it. You can see some of these artifacts in person. You can pick up these pictures and look through photo albums and kind of take a step back in time to life with the Smith family. But it is an active exhibit. We're always adding things and looking for new pieces of that story to tell. We are very fortunate here at Charlotte that we can work down here in our building on the 2nd floor.
Getting back to the railroads, all the engines back then were coal fired. I didn't see any coal sheds. Where did they get their coal from?
That's a good question. Does anybody know?
They had a coal table. It was shown in one of the later photos. You can see it from Elm Street. I don't know if it's in that overhead view you have looking north. No, that one. It's it was further. Yeah, I don't think you can't see it. It used to be further back, and it probably was taken down by the time this photo was taken. But there was a huge protocol, and that's how they found all the work.
Any questions for Alex, please? Thank you.